If you have topics you would like to have us discuss on the Aging Well podcast, please click on the links in the episode description to send us a text or record your message or comments. We'd love to hear from you and how we can help you age well. If you benefit from the Aging Well podcast and would like to support the content financially, please click on the Support the Show link or support our affiliates and advertisers. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast. I'm Jeff Armstrong here with Corbin Bruton. In this and the episodes that follow, we will share candid discussions on aging and hear from the experts. We are here to inform and encourage as we experience, aging. For many of us, muscle mass has been lost over the years, or perhaps it has not been a focus of our exercise training, and we want to focus on increasing our strength and muscle mass. In this episode, Dr. Armstrong and Corbin Bruton discuss the basic physiology behind muscle hypertrophy, muscle memory, and the impact of concurrent strength and endurance training for aging well.
So recently I started watching the movie Pumping Iron again, and it's absolutely awesome. I also went down a little YouTube rabbit hole with Tyrone Bell and the site House of Hypertrophy, and I was thinking, wow, this all kind of ties in to what we discuss in our podcast. We talk a lot about resistance training and muscle gaining and the importance of what it does. But for our listeners, even though we've mentioned it in the past of the word hypertrophy, what is hypertrophy exactly?
Well, hypertrophy basically is just an enlargement of the cell. You can use it in any kind of tissue cell. We don't generally talk about hypertrophy when we're getting fat, but that's what fat is. The fat cell gets larger, and so our bellies get larger. Same thing with skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle, when it is stimulated, will increase its size. When I talked about fat cells can also undergo what's called hyperplasia, which means the fat cells divide and increase their number, which is we increase our body fat, it becomes much more efficient for the cell to divide and to store fat in more cells rather than fewer cells. Skeletal muscle doesn't do that. So at least the understanding now and the evidence in the literature now is that muscle gets bigger by muscle hypertrophy. And so hypertrophy is just essentially the muscle getting bigger. Recent evidence indicates that there may be 2, possibly 3 types of hypertrophy, and those will be affected much more by the type of training that you do, and the outcomes will be a little bit different too. In the past, we say, hypertrophy of the muscle, you make it larger, greater cross-sectional area means greater force output. Well, not necessarily. And so those 2 or 3 types of muscle hypertrophy are first sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which is essentially when the muscle grows in volume, but less so with the muscle proteins. So the muscle myofilaments don't get as big relative to the sarcoplasmic volume of the cell. And so this is what bodybuilders often go for, because with bodybuilding, size is the critical factor, strength is not. Nobody on a bodybuilding stage when they're posing and performing is having to demonstrate strength. And so if I can build my biceps to the size of Arnold's by just simply doing 10-pound curls, I really can't. But if I could, and I could develop that hypertrophy from that, that's better than me being able to curl 50 pounds, but not get the same amount of size. So sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is a little bit more the aesthetic hypertrophy. It has a little less connection with strength gains and strength performances. The second type of hypertrophy is myofibrillar hypertrophy. And this is where there's myofibrils, the actin, the myosin, the muscle proteins increase their thickness and size relative to the sarcoplasmic volume as well. And so there's a greater increase in those rather than just the volume of the cell itself. Now, there's a third possible type that I've come across that is a little bit more suspect, but it's referred to as myofibrillar packing. And this is where you're seeing a gain in the myofibrillar size without much gain at all in the sarcoplasmic volume. And so the muscle becomes much more denser, but much more stronger. And that's what you're going to see in your more pure strength training individuals, your power lifters, your Olympic weightlifters, and those types of things. Now, the desired hypertrophy is going to differ on what are your goals. Are you going for purely aesthetics, or are you going for purely performance, or are you going for a little bit of both? In some situations, like Olympic weightlifters, they are in weight classes. And so how much you lift is relative to your weight class. And so it's much more ideal to gain dense muscle that is not going to give you as much added body weight, but is going to give you a lot more force production. We already mentioned from a bodybuilding standpoint, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is a little bit more desirable because you have much more size relative to the gains in strength.
Now, do you think this also ties in with the different types of muscle fibers that we have? Is that going to be affected by the type of hypertrophy that we get, or is it simply just going to be the type of training that we do?
Type of training is, you have the principle of specificity. The body makes specific adaptations to impose demands. And so we do have 3 fiber types in the muscle, and those generally need to be considered as well in the type of hypertrophy that we will get. You have the type 1 muscle fibers, which are your slow fatiguing, or you can also consider kind of slow contracting, although they're not really slow. They're just slower than the other muscle fibers. So your slow oxidative muscle fibers, those are your aerobic muscle fibers. And then you have the 2 types of type 2. You have type 2A and type 2X. Type 2A are labeled as slow oxidative glycolytic. So they rely both on oxygen for their contraction, so they can be aerobic, but they're also a bit more anaerobic, where they produce a little bit more lactic acid. And then you have your type 2X fibers, which are the strongest force-producing muscle fibers. They contract at the fastest speed, and they also have a greater tendency for hypertrophy. But also you have to consider, kind of with the nature of training, that we actually tend to see a shift more toward type 2A muscle fibers with any type of training, but particularly heavy resistance training, because those muscle fibers not only develop greater force generating capacity, but they also generate a capacity to sustain effort, to resist fatigue. And so training is going to impact those types of fibers. So the nature of the training you do is going to affect the nature of the fibers that you are recruiting. And the higher the intensity exercise that you're doing, the more muscle fibers that you are recruiting. And so ideally, if you want to hypertrophy and develop the capacity of all your muscle fibers, you need to be training probably at an intensity somewhat greater than about 75% of your maximum in order to be able to recruit all those muscle fibers. So if I go to the gym and I do that, all the exercises I can do with the 10-pound dumbbell, like we reported in the, I think it was episode 40, perhaps, and I can do hundreds of repetitions of those, I am not necessarily going to be really taxing my type 2 muscle fibers. I'm not going to see a significant amount of hypertrophy, but my oxidative capacity of that muscle is going to be stimulated much, much more.
If it's about intensity, now we talk a lot about a 5x5 program, and you're mentioning, I can do 100 reps. If I do 100 reps, I'm not going to see as much of a benefit as intensity. So for our listening population that's trying to essentially age well, it seems to me that the heavier that they're lifting, the better off it is. It's better to lift heavier with a repetition of 4 versus a lighter weight of, 15 or 20.
I discussed my epigenetics test with True Diagnostic co-founder Hannah Wendt in episode 162. Epigenetic testing measures baseline and changes in your pace of aging, giving you the power to steer your anti-aging or health and wellness journey in the right direction. I learned that I am aging well. Click on the affiliate link in the episode description, use the promo code AGEWELL, and receive a 12% discount on your epigenetics test and monitor your pace of aging. Again, with age, going too heavy might not be the wisest thing. That five by five program is helpful because it actually benefits both strength and hypertrophy, and a little bit more to the strength side, as opposed to if we do like an 8 to 12 rep scheme that is often prescribed, particularly for the elderly. Sometimes, a lot of sources will say more than 15 repetitions for the elderly. And it's like, I don't know that I agree with that, because we want to build strength. And so 5 by 5 is pretty good. If you start getting below 5, that's where you're pushing pure strength, which isn't necessarily bad for seniors, but in many cases they may not have, again, depending on when you've started the lifting, what your experience is with lifting and things like that, there could be a greater risk of injury going too heavy in the weight. And again, heavy is a relative term. When we talk heavy, we're talking relative to your maximum. So your current strength level. So if I can bench 300 pounds, that's my one repetition maximum. So if I'm lifting sets of, say, 250 pounds for 5 repetitions, that's going to be a fairly heavy workload for me, and that's going to stimulate growth. For somebody who is just starting out, the 45-pound bar might be heavy for them, and that might be a strain doing 5 repetitions for them. Their one repetition maximum might be 115 pounds, maybe even less than that. And so when we look at lifting heavy, we can't compare ourselves to somebody else in the gym. That big power lifter across the gym that's squatting 500 pounds, he's doing what is heavy for him. And my 500 pounds might be light for him. Who knows? But what is heavy for us? And so as aging adults, our goal, if we want to progress in strength and potentially hypertrophy the muscles a little bit, if we're capable of doing that, or at least maintaining our muscle mass, we need to do what is heavy for us.
And to have it be heavier for us, are we shooting for a level of fatigue? Like our last 2 reps should be like, it's so challenging, I can't get it up. Or should it be like a comfortable thing? Should you be heavily breathing after that last set? Is your heart going to be elevated? I know the answer, but I'm just asking for our most general listener.
Again, that's a very nuanced kind of question as well. It depends largely on your goals, how many sets you're doing. You do 1 repetition, that's hard, but you're not going to necessarily be breathing heavy after that. You tend to be maybe breathing a little bit heavier after doing more repetitions, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily building, strength and hypertrophy. I can do 50 push-ups and I'm going to be breathing heavy, but that may not be the stimulus that's really going to develop hypertrophy for me. And so you want to be doing enough that's going to stimulate the muscle within the parameters of what you're trying to improve. And so if I'm trying to improve strength, then I want to be probably somewhere in that range of being able to do anywhere from 1 to 5 repetitions, maybe even a little bit higher in my rep range. I don't have to take it to failure, and by taking it to failure means that last rep, you couldn't possibly do another one without crushing yourself with the weight. We don't necessarily have to push to that point where we are sore after lifting, or we are just so fatigued we can't really move, because that takes away from our capacity to recover. And so we just need to stimulate. I forget, I think it was Lee Haney, the bodybuilder, used to say, stimulate, don't annihilate.
Mm-hmm.
And, we don't have to just tear apart that muscle every time. You go in, you give a stimulus, it's going to promote growth. It's going to promote protein synthesis. You're going to get some growth. And so sometimes it might help to really push it. But you have to consider, can I recover from this? And generally what I'd recommend is in more of a periodization plan as we're cycling our exercise, we're increasing either our weight, our number of repetitions, or our sets with each week in a cycle so that last week might be where, okay, now if I'm doing a 5x5, my, final set of that exercise I'm really straining to get that fifth repetition in. And then I know that I'm going to deload from that and I'm going to start another cycle which might be a little bit lighter and progress again to a heavier near maximal. So sometimes you'll hear people, in talking about programming exercise, they'll talk about having repetitions in the tank. And, early on in a training cycle, we might have more repetitions in that tank, meaning that we could do more repetitions if asked to. And then as the cycles progress, we add a little bit more each week so that in the kind of final week of that cycle, we're a little bit closer to 0 to 1 repetition in the tank. That makes sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. You did mention earlier that it kind of depends on when an individual started their resistance training, like what phase. Let's say we had an individual that started in their teens, 20s, 30s, and then life happened. It kind of got the best of them. Now they're, in their senior age and they want to still maintain, they want to age well. Well, it kind of goes back to that old saying, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. Do you think that's a true statement?
Well, absolutely. It's a true statement. I mean, well, all you have to do is look at all your high school peers and those who stop exercising, the best athletes stop working out. You see them at the 20-year reunion and they don't look at all like they were ever an athlete. That's the most evidence for that, use it or lose it.
But we have talked in a previous podcast that if an individual starts training or has that resistance training at a younger age, they're kind of putting that base foundation in, almost like putting those muscles into a bank stored up. Potentially, are they able to potentially reactivate that in the future?
Yeah, and that the beauty of the use it or lose it principle is that there's also or the principle of reversibility, which is essentially the use it or lose it, is that reversibility can be reversed. If we lose what we have gained, we can gain it back, and generally we tend to gain back a little bit faster than we gained it in the first place. Obviously, it's going to depend on how long you've waited. I mean, if you lifted heavily in your 20s and you stop after college and you don't decide until you're well into your 50s that you need to get back into shape, it's going to be a little bit harder to regain that. But the shorter the span is between when we stopped working out and when we start working out again, the easier it is to bring that all back. And there's a fair amount of growing evidence to the phenomenon that's referred to as muscle memory. Sometimes we think of muscle memory in the idea of when you train in a certain movement pattern, your muscle, and it's not really the muscle it's memorizing that, it's your neural pathways that are remembering that so that you can repeat that movement correctly in the future. But from a muscle memory standpoint, that's referring to our capacity to regain what we have lost. And that comes back to how we have stimulated the muscle and kind of what remains in the muscle after we have trained it. And it seems that a lot of that comes down to the development of the myonuclei. The nuclei in a cell, as most people are probably aware, is what that control center in the cell, and that's what tells the cell what to do. It directs protein synthesis and all that kind of stuff. And if you are lifting regularly at really any age, you're stimulating those myonuclei. And in order for a cell to grow significantly, it has to be able to communicate. Those nuclei have to communicate with the muscle fibers that are surrounding it. And so the more myonuclei we have, the more hypertrophy we can develop. It's just kind of the nature of it. And some of that is genetics. So some people are just naturally born with more myonuclei than another individual. And this is where we sometimes get those responders, non-responders when it comes to resistance training. But the beauty of it is if we start young, when we have more of these satellite cells and we have more of these young cells in the muscle increases the number of myonuclei. And so that gives better communication with the muscle fibers and a greater capacity for hypertrophy. And if those remain in the cell or in the tissue after years of not training, but we can reactivate them and get them communicating with the muscle again, we're more likely to see a better response. And so the take home from that is if you want to age well, when it comes to skeletal muscle, you want to start earlier rather than later. You're going to get much better success in life in regards to muscle performance if you start early and ideally maintain that activity. But if you stop doing what you're doing and you go back to it, you're going to see a better return to it.
But how early is too early?
Too early to what? To improve your muscle fibers?
Yeah, how early is too early?
I don't know that there is really a too early. I mean, the earliest you can start is the moment that those muscle cells are generated. And so, can you argue that within the womb, you are actually developing some of those muscle fibers? Obviously, there's no resistance training going on in the womb. You have some babies that are a little bit more active than others. And maybe, I don't know that there's any literature to support this, but maybe those babies are ones that tend to have more muscle fibers, and that's why they're activating those muscles more. Who knows? But once the child is born, once it pops out of the womb, that's the time to really start developing those mononuclei or myonuclei, not mononuclei. You start having active children. What do we do when we play with children? You take their feet, and what do they do when you grab onto their feet? Reflexively, they start pushing against you. That's resistance training. And so I always argue that, the time to start resistance training is at birth. And obviously, we're not putting barbells on the backs of our toddlers and things like that and telling them to squat. But the more weight-bearing type of activity that a child, and this is both male and female, the more weight-bearing activity they're getting prior to puberty is probably going to set the stage for how much muscle they're able to ultimately grow.
And I think we've mentioned that in a past podcast. We talked about the importance of enrolling children into sports at such a young age. In this particular thing, it almost seems like gymnastics might be the best way to go as far as resistance training and building that muscle, building those muscles fibers and throwing in that strength in at a young age. And then once they hit adolescence and they're able to, be more aware of their ever so changing body, then add in that weight training. Would you agree with that? Or is that?
I mean, I wouldn't just limit it to gymnastics, and it's any kind of weight-bearing activity. So you're getting involved in any kind of sport. I'm a huge proponent for schools increasing physical education as opposed to decreasing it. And, doing activities that are requiring a significant amount of complexity within the motor control is going to be important for these kids. And, doing push-ups or, doing rope climbs in PE class. I hated the rope climbs. I could never do them. But, those are important activities for kids to begin to be building the muscles and building that foundation for future resistance training. They can do a lot of body weight movements. We've talked about the basic 5: squat, hip hinge, the push, the basically the horizontal push or the bench press, the row, and the overhead press. Those are all things a kid can do of any age. And, they might not be squatting with weight, but body weight types of squats, doing activities that require the squat, developing a proper hip hinge. That should be a foundational physical educational activities that kids should be doing from an early age. I don't know that we do enough of that. I know from working with athletes that, or even just observing young athletes, that we probably don't get enough of those types of movements. Still see kids even in high school that still can't do a proper push-up, can't do a proper plank, even doing a proper squat. Those are all things that should be foundational in our physical education classes. But if we didn't get that, there's no reason why we can't at any age pick it up and start learning it. The key is we just have to realize that as we age, we're probably not going to see quite the same level of muscle hypertrophy that we would see in our younger years. But remember that, increases in strength in the short term, due to short-term resistance training, are largely going to be the result of changes in the neuromuscular system or the neurosystem. So being able to, stimulate motor units, recruit motor units, and coordinate movement patterns and those types of things. In the long term is going to be a combination of the nervous system adaptations, increases in muscle mass, and increases in type 1 force production. Those can still happen as we get older, maybe just not to the same extent. But okay, so I don't hypertrophy as much when I get older. That doesn't mean I shouldn't keep lifting weights. I can get stronger. I just may not see the same body changes for that strength. Strength might not come as fast as it did when you were younger, but we can increase strength at any age.
Well, then it's also, I mean, just as we've talked, it's whether you're going for strength or not, you're still having an overall benefit on the body, right? You're still affecting your ability to stand. You're still affecting your core strength. You're still affecting. It's almost like you're ever so slightly rewinding the clock on aging, essentially. So we're talking a lot about exercise here as far as the resistance training portion, but there's a huge movement out there that's primarily focusing on like aerobic activity, and then it kind of comes into that argument. You can't really gain strength and build endurance at the exact same time. You and I both know that's essentially a myth. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about concurrency.
Okay. So yeah, that's been kind of one of those historic misunderstandings, I think, in exercise science, that you can't do concurrent strength and endurance training because it's going to impede your strength gains. And as well, I think it can impede your aerobic performances as well. And there's a lot behind that. They used to think, some of it is kind of the neural adaptations. Again, going back to the principle of specificity, you have these kind of conflicting neural inputs to the muscle. There's been, other thoughts that because you're doing so much, the body can't adapt to it. But really, when it comes down to why you should try to avoid concurrent strength training and endurance training, I think it's a little bit multifaceted. On one hand, if you are training within a single session and you are wanting to build both strength and endurance, and so you're doing an aerobic activity, say you're running on a treadmill for part of your workout, you have an hour, say, to work out. So you're doing a half hour on a treadmill, half hour of weights. Well, if I'm running on a treadmill for half an hour and then I go do my weights, my muscles are now fatigued. I'm not going to be able to lift as much weight, which means I'm not going to be stimulating the muscle to grow as much. And so I don't stimulate the muscle as much, and so I get a little less growth. Or if I do my strength first and then I attempt to run, I can't push my cardiovascular system quite as hard because my muscles are already fatigued. I'm not going to be able to run as fast or run up a hill as much, or, I can't push the stationary cycle hard enough because I'm already fatigued. And so that is a component of it. And I'll talk here in a moment about kind of how we can get around that. But it's probably much more down to the cellular level in terms of impeding the results. Rapamycin, as we may have mentioned in the previous podcast about agelessness, but it's one of those targeted drugs that are being considered for reversing the aging process. Mechanistic target of rapamycin, that's the target of that rapamycin drug. It's more commonly referred to as mTOR. The M also comes from mammalian or mouse. It's a major regulator of protein synthesis and muscle size. And so theory is that mTOR is what signals for the muscle to grow and to begin to stimulate muscle or protein synthesis. In endurance exercise, that training increases another enzyme, which is, I'm just going to refer to it as AMK or AMPK. And that activates another set of stimuli that basically improves your oxidative capacity. And essentially, without getting too biochemical with any of that or too much into the physiology, those two processes tend to affect one another. If you stimulate that or activate the AMPK, that tends to impair protein synthesis. And a good way to kind of think of that in the simplest terms is if I'm doing a lot of aerobic activity, it is far less effective and efficient for my body to be carrying around a lot of extra muscle mass. And those proteins could go into energy. It could go into building other enzymes for aerobic capacity. And so the body tends to favor a physiological state that is going to be most efficient or effective for the type of training that it's doing. Again, that's the principle of specificity. Whereas mTOR is favoring protein synthesis. And so when you're doing the two, they're they're competing against each other. And so you're less likely to see significant resistance training or strength gains or muscle hypertrophy gains when you are combining concurrent endurance and resistance training. Now, we can talk in a future podcast as well about the concept of hybrid training, favored by Alex Viada. He has found some techniques to be able to kind of manipulate those stimuli in order to optimize gains in both. But a thing to still consider, even if we train as well as possible in a single concurrent exercise training session, we're still not going to see the same level of benefits that we would get from more compartmentalizing of those stimuli, doing aerobic exercise on a different day than we're doing our strength training exercise. So I tend to favor, again, a more compartmentalized approach that would involve a maybe shorter, intensive resistance training workout at one part of the day, and then an endurance activity separated by maybe 6 to 8 hours later in the day to be able to optimize the benefits of both of those with the least amount of training stimuli. And so for the listener who's thinking about, well, I only have 3 days a week that I can go to the gym, and I want to get the most benefit out of that workout, and I need to improve my cardiovascular fitness, and I want to improve my muscular fitness. First thing is, if that's what you got to do, and you only have 3 days, say 3 hours a week to do it, if you can you find some more days to do that or more time in the day to do the training sessions? But if you can't, if that's what your limitations are and you want to make the most of those, then certainly we have to be as smart as possible with the training. We have to emphasize what is the most important goal. And I would say for the aging population, particularly as we age, maintaining that muscle mass is going to be a much higher priority than, and I got to watch how I phrase this because it's not that you're cardiorespiratory endurance is not a high priority. It's a little bit easier to maintain that. So increasing our VO2 max is not going to be as important as maintaining and increasing our muscle fiber hypertrophy. And so I would emphasize more the strength training, minimize the amount of cardiovascular training that you're doing, and build more muscle, because if you build more muscle, you're going to be able to sustain those cardiovascular activities. You can get more physical activity that's going to help to maintain that cardiovascular fitness. And so I would prioritize the strength, get in what endurance you can afterwards. So more strength training, a little bit less on the endurance side, trying to maybe do a little bit more intensive aerobic activity, maybe incorporating a few short, high-intensity interval resistance training workouts that will kind of meet the goals of both. But realize that you're not going to get the best of both worlds. You're going to get a little bit better of both worlds by doing concurrent training. But if you want to get the most optimal results, you have to be specific in your training.
Have a goal and reach for it, essentially.
Yep.
So
I don't think we covered really everything possible in regards to the physiology of resistance training. But we can certainly come back to this in future podcasts, and I encourage the listener to click on the link that we have available in the episode description, where they can record a question for us, or they can email us a question that might get a little bit more specific in questions that they may have regarding the physiology of resistance training, endurance training, whatever it might be. But hopefully, we're kind of chipping away at the misinformation that might be out there in regards to exercise, providing a little bit better information, and simplifying it in a way that is making everybody be able to do the exercise that's going to help them age well.
Aging well.
Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.